Hey there friends and enemies, JoPa here again, and today I want to go over my 5 most disappointing video games of 2024, keeping in mind that I don't necessarily consider these the worst games of the year, but in my personal opinion, these are the ones that disappointed me the most for several reasons. Now, I do have some honorable mentions to start off with. We've got Skull and Bones. That's one that I know a lot of people didn't like, but for me, I didn't have high expectations after all the delays and everything, so I wasn't quite as disappointed. I would have been a couple years ago when it was first announced because the game looked awesome. Some other disappointments were games that didn't even release but were supposed to this year, with The Division Heartland and Blue Protocol, both of which got ultimately canceled, and that was very unfortunate news for me personally. But heading into the list and starting at number 5 is The First Descendant. Now this is where caveats are needed. I enjoyed The First Descendant quite a bit. I think the base game is not bad. It has a lot of things to like about it. Definitely a gooner game for people who are into that kind of stuff. And for me, it was just the frustrating lack of diversity in the end game and the reason to farm harder content. I felt like when you are establishing a new looter shooter, you want the game to feel fun at endgame, so that way you have like a Destiny raid or some of Warframe's endgame stuff that is missing from the First Descendant, and it makes it feel a little bit like a letdown once you've completed the campaign and done everything. Again, this is not a bad game, and I do think it's got the potential to recover, but this year I was hoping this would be my next major looter shooter that I was going to dive deep into, and that just never was the case with the First Descendant. I played it for a while, I still jumped back in to play new content, but for that reason, it was a big disappointment. Next up is going to be Concord. That's a game that I think a lot of people assumed would flop, but I personally was hopeful because of some things that they mentioned gameplay-wise. Now, the character designs were not all that good. I think they were definitely frustrating. The gunplay actually felt really good in my opinion, but one of the major issues for me was the hard focus on the story content, and most PvP players don't really care about that. They aren't going to get fully invested in these cutscenes when there's no PvE content to go along. It's not like a campaign that you're playing separately, and I think that was a major misfire and probably cost them a lot of money. I also think the design of having a game PvP specific be $40, $30, whatever the case may be, and then you unlock all the cosmetics makes some sense, and it's something that a lot of people have been asking for. It's just this hero shooter, they didn't do enough with the marketing, with the way they designed the game, with everything, and unfortunately that means Firewalk Studios, the developers behind Concord, ended up getting shut down, which is really unfortunate as somebody who is rooting for developers to succeed as often as possible. But that's a game that when I first saw it, I thought looked interesting. I do think they misfired on a lot of the way they advertised the games, which is very, very unfortunate. And ultimately, while the game was fun, after a while you played it for a few hours, it did feel like something you'd played before, and that's where it doesn't really stand out. And that's going to bring me to my number 3, which is also a multiplayer PvP game in XDefiant. Now, this one is still ongoing and could face a big turnaround, but with the very successful Black Ops 6 just released, it feels like XDefiant has seen its time come and go. And the main reason this one is disappointing is I understand they need to try to perfect the game as much as possible, but they absolutely missed the window where this could have been successful. There was a time where people were begging for multiplayer games that were fun and exciting and really felt like old school video games. Now, some of the problems with XDefiant were in addition to the launch date, such as there was some hit registration issues, the lagging in the netcode, all that kind of stuff was a little bit frustrating. There was a lot of hitching, and I feel like that can be a big problem in a game that you want to be competitive. I also think, and a lot of people disagree with me on this, but the lack of SBMM is something that probably hurt this game long term, because all of the casual players would have left to go back to another game where they can have more success. And again, people who are at the top end of the skill level never want to hear that, but I do feel like it is a factor when you consider the majority of people playing games right now and how wide and mainstream video games have gotten in 2024. There are far more people playing video games than we've ever seen in the past, and because of that, it does lead to developers trying to design their games to keep those players interested quite a bit, and that's not something XDefiant really did, because it's so sweaty at times. It's very easy to get stomped if you're not very good, if it's your first time jumping into the game and you've only been playing for a short amount of time. And so because of that, I do feel like the game struggles with that quite a bit. The retention of the average player is just not there. And like it or not, streamers, YouTubers, hardcore players, they can all disagree. But if there's no one left to pub stomp, then it's going to feel like SBMM is back in the game because of how sweaty every single game is. Number 2 for me is going to be Star Wars Outlaws. Now, this is not a bad game. I mentioned that several times with other games on the list, but some of these games are very fun and they do find an audience. For me though, the hyper focus on stealth with this, same thing for Indiana Jones, which is more a adventure action game than action adventure, that's not for me. And that's fine, but when we first saw Star Wars Outlaws, I thought it was going to be more of a rogue's journey with a lot more combat and Star Wars types of stuff that I would be able to enjoy. And so that being lacking was very disappointing for me personally. I do feel like there is potential still for the game to find success over the long haul, but it felt like they leaned too far into one gameplay style instead of giving players more of that freedom in the gameplay that they're looking for. There was a lot of freedom when it comes to your factions and the missions you take on, how you interact with various NPCs. I think that was all very good. And those are some parts of the game that I think were very successful. But because the combat and the gunplay and all that stuff was lacking, that's why this game falls apart a little bit for me, especially when you consider the Jedi Fallen Order series is so well done. The combat there is excellent, and I was hoping to have a similar experience with a Star Wars game that doesn't involve Jedi or lightsabers. And unfortunately, like I mentioned, that just isn't the case, which was extremely unfortunate for me. But number 1 is another looter shooter that, again, I was really hopeful would be my long-term home when it comes to the genre. I have played Destiny for over 10 years now. It's one of my favorite games, and I wanted another looter shooter to kind of fill that void, as I've been playing less of that in recent times. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is the game that I was really hopeful for. And take it with a grain of salt for me. I am a person who enjoyed Marvel's Avengers for what it was. I really like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. A looter shooter or MMO type game with superheroes is the perfect type of game for me. However, where I'm most disappointed with Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is the endgame, which was incredibly repetitive, and the way they did seasons. Unfortunately, because the game underperformed to such a degree, they just never released the seasonal content that we were promised. And that leads us to only having bare bones updates, so there's no excitement or reason to come back. Every season felt like another time doing the same exact thing. You might play 20 minutes of a story, unlocking a new character, all that stuff, but other than that, it was just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And for me, it was just really a letdown. It reminded me a lot of Avengers when it went from we got a raid, we got all this really cool stuff, and now all of a sudden all these new characters that were supposed to be on the horizon got canceled. We still got several characters for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, but I'm assuming with Season 4, we got the last one with Lawless, and I'm assuming with Season 4 and likely Deathstroke that that'll be the end of the game, and we'll have seen the full story, which again I thought was pretty interesting and was pretty excited to see where it went after the main campaign of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. And yeah, that leaves me with my top 10 or top 5, most disappointing video games of 2024. I could go through and add 5 additional games potentially if you want to see another list, but for me, those are the ones that for several reasons just didn't live up to my expectations, and it's really unfortunate because the First Descendant, Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League, Concord, those are all games that I would still be playing to this day if there was a exciting reason to do so, and there just isn't. And so the chasing of the live service bag, you compare those games to Helldivers 2, which is still kicking, still putting up really respectable numbers with regards to the player base, and you just see the disparity between a good live service and a not so good one. And so hopefully in the future we get better ones and we don't have to worry about these types of lists. But let me know what your most disappointing game or games are in the comments down below. Like the video as always, comment, subscribe. My name is JoPa. Have a good one. I'll catch you all later.